Hello and welcome to the webinar Aligning Technology Roadmaps with Consumer Reality, Ultra-Processed Foods. My name is Harini Venkatraman, Associate Research Director here at Lux, and I'll be moderating today's session. Joining me today are my colleagues, Lauren Gilhooly, Consultant, and Urbi Pathak, Analyst here at Lux. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the questions box that you see on your screen. Time permitting, we'll answer all the questions that we can. Now, if it doesn't get answered, please don't hesitate to send us an email to questions@luxresearchinc.com. I'll make sure to respond back immediately. If at any point you experience technical difficulties such as frozen screen or any other sound-related problems, simply refresh your browser and check that your internet connection is strong. Now, let's dive right into the discussion. Over to you, Lauren and Urbi.
All right, thanks, Harini. All right, hello everyone, welcome. It's perhaps no surprise that ultra-processed food is getting a lot more regulatory attention these days. We're seeing governments are debating labeling changes, discussing various restrictions, and increasingly referencing processing levels in public health guidance. But there's still no single globally agreed definition of what ultra-processed actually means. And at the same time, the term has taken on a life of its own in public conversation. Consumers are really trying to interpret the concept of ultra-processed foods without a whole lot of context. And that's how we see conversations shifting from technical policy debates to some perhaps idiosyncratic behaviors among consumers, such as washing Skittles in the sink to rinse off the food dye. This might sound odd, but this was a very real trend, albeit a short-lived one last summer, where consumers were concerned about the number and volume of processed ingredients that their kids were exposed to, so they shared videos on TikTok and Instagram of them rinsing food dye off of their Skittles. Now, of course, other consumers were quick to point out that getting rid of food dye doesn't really do anything to address the issues associated with high sugar levels, but nevertheless, this behavior does tell us something really important about the very real anxiety that many consumers are grappling with around this increased awareness of processed foods and their potential health risks. Now, for companies, this creates a very complicated reality. Some products may technically qualify as ultra-processed and still play a perfectly acceptable role in consumers' lives. Others may be compliant with regulation, but feel questionable because of public perception. So the challenge isn't simply avoiding the label of ultra-processed. It's figuring out how to operate in a space where scrutiny is increasing, definitions are evolving, and consumers are still deciding what that term actually means for them. And that challenge is our topic of discussion for today.
So we'll start with the innovation dilemma facing ultra-processed foods, and then we will introduce our Lux Innovation Helix, which is the framework for aligning consumer urgency with the technological readiness. And finally, we'll apply the Helix to show where growth is actually landing, and then close with some concrete action plans.
Now, there are three key structural shifts that are converging and really reshaping this landscape. We have, first, the scientific scrutiny is expanding drastically. Between 2024 and 2025, multiple meta-analyses were increasingly linking high ultra-processed food consumption with cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and even mortality. Meanwhile, the public narrative is also maturing. Concerns over industrial formulations are driving regulatory pressure, from high-fat salt and sugar restrictions in the UK to front-of-pack labeling and expanding across Europe, and the addition of advanced warning labels in Latin America, just to name a few. Now, these concerns are quickly eroding trust among consumers. For example, Google Trends data suggests that consumers are more interested in topics related to ultra-processed foods compared to in the past, and they're increasingly equating processing with harm, even when those associations are technically inaccurate or unfounded. Of Of course, the key tension here is that most major food companies are structurally built around the same scalable processed formats that consumers are scrutinizing. So the real question isn't if companies should abandon ultra-processed foods altogether, but rather how do they align scalable food technologies with evolving definitions of health, safety, and trust.
And that is right. The risk isn't that ultra processed foods will somehow disappear, but the risk is actually stagnation or growth without alignment. So if companies over index on compliance alone, they risk becoming no growth players. But if they ignore the cultural and regulatory shifts, they risk backlash, like we saw with the recent Poppy's lawsuit over their gut health claims. So my question would for Lauren would be, how do companies actually align their scalable food technologies with this evolving definitions of health, safety, and trust?
Yeah, I think the strategic imperative here really is alignment. It's not reaction or retreat. We can't just do away with these products altogether. It's about figuring out what's important to consumers and actioning on that. Because as we all know, every year, hundreds of new food and beverage products launch globally, but the reality is that most of them fail, not because the science was wrong or the technology didn't work. They fail because technology and real human needs are out of sync. And we're seeing this play out very clearly in ultra-processed foods right now. So on the one side, the industry is pushing technologies because they are technically feasible. Think of protein fortification, sugar replacements, functional ingredients, precision fermentation. All of these things are scientifically very exciting, but consumers are increasingly questioning the act of processing itself. And at the same time, companies are launching fragmented responses to consumer demand. And without a coordinated strategy, these become isolated bets rather than a portfolio transformation. And sometimes the problem is simply timing. Think about Kellogg's early protein cereal launches, for example, which were nutritionally enhanced, but really arrived before consumers were truly focused on protein density. Now the market is exploding with protein demand, driven largely by GLP-1 conversations. And of course, competitors are really capturing that momentum. We can also look at plant-based meat as another good example. For years, it was framed as the future of food, but when that cultural sentiment shifted, growth stalled almost overnight. And that's when we see the symptoms. For example, fragmented strategies, mistimed launches, or missed opportunities. And when technology and human demand move out of sync, organizations lose clarity on where to invest and where to act. And the challenge for the food industry today is not whether innovation will happen, it's whether it will happen in the right places. And that is the problem that the Lux Innovation Helix was designed to solve. And that's because innovation isn't random. It happens when human urgency and technological readiness intersect. Now I want you to imagine two strands twisting upward like DNA. One carries the pulse of human demand, people's frustrations, aspirations, and needs, and the other carries the force of technology, the breakthroughs and capabilities ready to be applied. And where those two strands meet, bonds form. And each bond marks a moment where a real human need connects with a ready technology. When those bonds cluster, they light up like genetic markers of growth, showing exactly where adoption will surge and telling you exactly what you should be focusing on right now. So this is what the Lux Innovation Helix does. It connects human demand and technology readiness, transforming innovation from guesswork into a living, evolving process. Just as DNA encodes life, the Helix encodes the DNA of future growth. And where those bonds are strongest, growth becomes inevitable. So what can it do for you? We work with clients from a wide variety of industries. And we've noticed that regardless of where our clients sit within their organization, they're often dealing with the same dilemma. What should we prioritize and when for the greatest impact? And the difference really lies in how you're approaching this dilemma. So executives, you see breakthrough technologies moving through your portfolios. Millions are spent on reformulations that consumers ultimately reject. Entire categories rise and stall, as we saw with plant-based meat. The question becomes, where should we actually invest for long-term growth? And that's where the Helix helps. It cuts through the noise to reveal where consumer urgency and technological readiness truly intersect, giving leadership confidence to prioritize the opportunities that will scale. Now, for R&D leaders, the challenge looks a little different. Your pipelines are overflowing, you're developing new sweeteners, new functional ingredients, and processing technologies. But the hardest question isn't whether something can be built, it's whether people will actually care. The Helix helps connect your capabilities directly to real human needs, ensuring the technologies you scale are the ones that matter. And finally, for insights professionals, you often know exactly how consumer expectations are shifting. You see signals around things like metabolic health and clean labels and ingredient transparency, but too often those insights arrive too late when the product is already designed. The Helix changes that dynamic. It gives insights teams a direct role in shaping innovation decisions, turning human signals into strategic direction. Ultimately, the Helix doesn't just change how innovation is analyzed, it creates a shared language across executives, R&D, and insights teams, a language that turns insight into action and innovation into growth. Here's a quick overview of the process behind the Helix. It starts with decoding that consumer strand, where our team of PhD anthropologists analyze hundreds of thousands of online conversations and product reviews to identify people's real unmet needs. And then we prioritize those needs based on urgency. And next, our STEM colleagues decode the technology strand, mapping which capabilities are truly able to meet those consumer needs today and which ones are still emerging. And we then prioritize those technologies by readiness. And finally, we create the bonds. We quantify the alignment between each need and each technology to reveal the strongest growth opportunities, where technological push and human pull align. We then look for high-scoring clusters and map them on the two axes of prioritized needs and technology to figure out the best timing. This is what turns innovation from intuition into evidence. And now we'll break down each step. So to tackle the consumer strand, we decoded tens of thousands of consumer reviews across dozens of e-commerce sites to identify pain and joy points in the context of ultra-processed foods. And that process led us to 8 key unmet needs aligned to innovation in ultra-processed foods. This is where anthropology really shines. We use the jobs to be done framework, a simple but powerful way to reframe consumer behavior as an action with a purpose. So people don't just buy products, they hire them to get something done, to solve a problem, to feel a certain way, to express who they are. But often there's friction, and that tension between what consumers want and what current solutions often deliver. And that friction is gold. It is the most reliable signal of opportunity. So we can take enhancing flavor, for example. Consumers need flavor that they can enjoy without feeling guilty. The tension here is that big flavor relies too much on sugar, salt, or other synthetic ingredients to deliver it. And as a result, consumers are hiring products with bold flavors and moderate levels of sugar and salt. Spices, herbs, and heat are all viewed as signals for better flavor. Meanwhile, they disparage foods with high levels of salt, sugar, or sweeteners that leave behind an unpleasant aftertaste. Now, each unmet need that you see here stems from thousands of unfiltered product reviews. And we rely on a team of PhD anthropologists who specialize in reading emotion between the lines to identify those unmet needs. And once we've identified those needs, the next question is, which needs deserve investment first? In any market, there are hundreds of unmet needs, but only a few have the potential for growth. So we developed a new metric to prioritize them, which is our needs urgency. And to calculate that, we consider 3 data-based indicators. We have share of voice, which is a reflection of how loudly consumers are expressing a pain point, cultural maturity, how ready people are to adopt a new solution, as well as population reach, which is an indication of how many people will culturally relate to this need in the near future. When you combine these, you get that needs urgency, a future forward score that shows where momentum, timing, and scale all intersect. And it helps us see not just what's loud today, but what's about to surge tomorrow. And based on this urgency score, we can then prioritize these unmet needs. So consumers' needs in this particular context of ultra-processed foods can be clustered into 3 general themes. We have sensory satisfaction, nourishment without compromise, as well as safety and responsible consumption. The level of nuance here demonstrates how much variety there is among consumers when it comes to their opinions on ultra-processed foods. They aren't simply looking for less sugar or less salt, although those are indeed important topics, but they're also looking to preserve or even enhance their sensory experiences. And they're eager to find solutions that add something to their day, whether it's improved digestion, more mindful eating, or convenient nutrition. And these increasingly knowledgeable consumers are showing more and more interest in the importance of nutrient sources and responsible eating habits. Now, all of these unmet needs are important in this context and may differ depending on the occasion, which can make it very difficult to identify which ones to prioritize. And that is where the urgency prioritization becomes crucial. By combining the share of voice, future maturity, and maximum population reach, we can quantify the importance of each unmet need. This is why we start with the consumer strand to find that pulse of what consumers really care about. Because innovation isn't about asking, what can we build? It's about asking, where are people stuck and why? Here we can see that flavor remains king. However, responsible eating has caught up to sensorial cues in terms of what's really important for consumers. So they're not just abandoning indulgence entirely, they're layering responsibility onto it. We can also see accelerating urgency around digestive comfort, portion control, and ingredient transparency. And the surge in GLP-1 use has only accelerated this conversation. So the real takeaway here is that consumers aren't just eating less, they're demanding higher nutrient density per bite. And this is an important structural shift, and it's one that can be addressed through technology.
Now that we have understood which consumer needs are becoming more urgent, the next step is to really identify the technologies that could realistically address them. So we started by scanning the food innovation landscape and selected these 10 technology areas that you see here. And those actually came repeatedly across, say, recent product launches or startup innovation and corporate R&D strategies that are currently shaping ultra-processed food portfolios. But simply identifying technologies isn't enough, right? We also need to understand which of these are actually ready to influence ultra-processed food portfolios. So we evaluated each of these technologies across 3 dimensions. So the first is the stage of development. So here we assess if the technology is still in the lab stage or is it already appearing in commercial products. For example, here in fiber fortification and sugar reduction systems, now these are already widely deployed across global brands, which puts them in a high development stage. The second is the market crowdedness. where we look at how many companies are actively working in this space. So, a highly crowded space can signal maturity, but they can also signal a competitive pressure. The third one is the time to scale. So, if a technology works, it may still face some kind of regulatory challenges or cost or scale up barriers, and that can delay adoption. So, by combining these three factors, we generate a technology readiness score, and that allows us to move beyond hype. And this is where, with the technology readiness score, we begin to see some clear patterns in how innovation around ultra processed foods is evolving. The first takeaway is that the nutrition enhancement technologies like fibers and prebiotics, then the nutrition density systems and the controlled release delivery platforms, those scored the highest in readiness and are currently the most mature and scalable pathways that are influencing ultra processed food portfolios. So they are already appearing across all major brands, whether it is in high protein dairy or fiber fortified snacks or reduced sugar beverages. Now, the second insight concerns the harm reduction technologies. And these include areas like sugar or salt reduction, traceability systems, and digital food classification tools. Now, while they are widely discussed, their impact tends to be quite incremental rather than transformational. So they improve the formulations or transparency, but they do not really fundamentally change how products deliver value to consumers. And as a result, the space is moderately competitive and crowded, with many companies pursuing similar reformulation strategies. Now, the third pattern relates to shelf life and preservation technologies. So, here you see solutions like minimal impact processing, clean label preservatives, and biopreservatives are gaining momentum, particularly as brands are trying to reduce additives while maintaining product stability, going all like clean label. So their adoption remains quite uneven actually across categories and geographies. And that also depends on, say, the policies or cost structures, the manufacturing capabilities. Now, what this tells us is that the innovation landscape around ultra processed foods is not uniform. Some technologies are already shaping portfolios today, while others are still evolving or facing scale up challenges. So, from this readiness prioritization and the distinction that we saw, we can see that many of the technologies that are relevant to ultra processed foods are already technically mature, especially the top five that you see here. So, they score highly because they are already commercialized, they are very much widely researched, patented, and increasingly integrated into product development pipelines. But readiness alone does not guarantee impact, right? A major challenge in the food industry today is that technologies may be available, but their success depends entirely on how well they align with these shifting consumer expectations. For example, take the natural additives here. Now, tech areas within them, like biopreservatives or clean label food colors, they have high consumer demand, but they often struggle to match their artificial counterparts in terms of functionality or cost efficiency or supply chain reliability. And that creates a tension that many R&D teams are quite familiar with today. And that is why the next step into Helix analysis is to connect these ready technologies with the consumer urgent needs that we have identified earlier. Once we map these technology readiness against consumer urgencies, that is where the strongest bonds begin to appear. And this is where it all comes together. Now, when we connect the two strands of consumer urgency and technology readiness, we see this helix becoming more powerful. So, along the vertical axis, we map the technologies that are prioritized by their readiness to scale in real world food portfolios. Across the horizontal axis, we map the consumer needs ordered from the most urgent in the left to the least urgent on the right. We then evaluate the strengths of alignment between each of these technologies and each of the consumer needs. A score of 5 indicates that the technology can directly and realistically address a consumer need today, while a lower score indicates kind of a weaker bond or a more speculative connection. Now, what begins to emerge from this process are clusters or bonds where strong technologies intersect, like you see here, and these clusters are where innovation is most likely to succeed. Now, this heat map that you see here is the analytical backbone of our Lux Innovation Helix. Now, each of these cells here represent a potential bond with a number from 1 to 5 and a shading. Now, all of this together with the number and the shading show the strength of alignment. So, higher the scores, darker the shades, it indicates a stronger bond, while lower score and lighter shade mark weaker or emerging ones. So, let's now look at what really happens when we map these bonds across the full system, starting with what the consumer insights team within organizations can infer from them.
All right, so the highlighted column that you see here really shows us that nutritional integrity was the highest scoring unmet need among consumers. And this represents an important opportunity because it tells us that consumers' concerns are related to a wide variety of technological solutions that crucially already exist. For example, we can see that the technological readiness assessment determined that controlled release systems and nutrient density, as well as minimal impact processing, are all well positioned to address consumers' unmet needs related to nutritional integrity. Meanwhile, topics like biopreservatives, process traceability were less relevant to consumers. Now, these could still be worth exploring from an R&D perspective, depending on your priorities and technological capabilities. And that is what makes the Helix so powerful. It gives organizations a common language to use between teams, which allows us to shift our perspective from what do consumers want to how can we deliver it. It gives us a concrete way to identify where we should place our bets. Now, I would like to know from Irby, what should R&D teams really understand from the consumer point of view?
Right. This innovation cluster that you see here on the top left, this is where the low-hanging fruit is, and that is where is the most relevant sweet spot for innovation leaders in the short term. And I will explain you why. When consumers are discussing the most urgent need of enhancing flavor, the verbatim that we saw is that they love bold tasting foods, but without just the dumping of sugar and fats or salt, which makes the foods tasty, obviously, but the consumers feel guilty in an hour. So, to address this, there are fibers and prebiotics that are coming mostly from natural sources like chicory roots or Jerusalem artichoke that also could be used as low calorie sweeteners. Now, when used with intended amounts, they can address the flavor concerns related to high sugars as well as the gut discomforts that are associated with high artificial sweetener intakes. So now, when you see technologies within controlled release of flavors and nutrients here, like encapsulation technologies or say microspheres to increase salt surface area, these are advancing in terms of technology per se, but still has the opportunities to bundle with, say, other sugar reduction technologies. At the same time, if you look at fibers and prebiotics and controlled release systems across the horizontal axis with all the unmet needs here, you see that they have the potential to address or support most of the consumers' urgent needs. Now, we are seeing these technologies move quickly into commercial portfolios like that of Nestle or Conagra brands or PepsiCo, who are already experimenting with a lot of fiber enrichment and sugar reduction technologies within their snacks or beverage portfolios. Or say the recent example of the Flavor House Maine, which already had an in-house taste modulation and controlled release system capability based on sugar and salt reduction or their modulation. But this month, they also announced a partnership with the protein engineering platform, Erzeda, to consolidate their platform further, adding steviol glycosides that they claim to address the bitterness related to steviol glycoside, which is Reb A, and is two-thirds the replacement cost of sugar. Now, another reason why this cluster is really powerful for R&D leaders is that it sits at the intersection of health outcomes and sensory performance. So for R&D and tech leaders here, the Helix becomes your compass, since instead of spreading innovation investments across dozens of disconnected reformulation efforts, companies can really concentrate resources on technology platforms that address multiple consumer needs at the same time. And for senior executives in the room today, for example, the corporate strategy and innovation teams, now this is where it all pays off. Your challenge isn't a lack of ideas, but it's actually too many of them. So if you remember from the maximum population reach scores that Lauren showed earlier, this cluster that you see here has mostly come up from between the early stage innovation to the zone of innovation. So they are pretty much on the early innovation stage. Now, the consumers' verbatim around portion control and eating behavior is that they feel that this combination of salt, sugar, and crunch, it's very much engineered in a way to keep them coming back to these foods. Now, even though the stuff that looks clean, it tricks you into refined carbs, hidden sweeteners, and portion packs. And this is where ingredient technologies and reformulation strategies around sugar reduction or nutrient density really has the potential to shape the food and beverage industry today. Now, this cluster also has high relevance to the ongoing metabolic health awareness in connection to the emerging GLP-1 or other weight loss drug medications. Now, additionally, there are other tech areas too. If you see here, like the minimal impact processing or say the digital food classification tools that will address concerns with food freshness and waste reduction, or with, say, avoiding processed oils in this case. So the Helix reveals clusters of opportunity where consumers' urgency and technology readiness really meet. Now, take, for example, the case of Danone and how their efforts towards this emerging category of weight loss drugs users have evolved. In this case study, you see here, it's a quite good example of how the large food companies are actually responding in a very strategic way to the changing conversation around ultra-processed foods. Now, if you look at Danone's portfolio, their products around dairy are technically ultra-processed foods under the Nova 3 or 4 classification, but rather than abandoning those processed food portfolios, Danone has been repositioning most of its existing brands like Oikos or Too Good and Co. around this concept of nutrient density and low sugar by emphasizing not just a formulation, but also a strong messaging around the functional nutrition for its metabolic health conscious consumers. And they are looking for support during the entire weight loss journeys. Now, if you look at the example of their Oikos' recent product, the Advanced Fusion Blend, that has a patented blend of whey, leucine, prebiotics, and vitamin D, now that claims to build and retain muscle mass and also to support digestive health during weight loss, which is a very important side effect that keeps coming up again and again. Now, this aligns closely with the innovation cluster that we have identified on the previous slide. A, because it's portion control and eating behavior, and how high protein dairy products like Oikos Pro and other fortified offerings are often packaged in single serve formats. So they deliver the kind of satiety and metabolic benefits that are increasingly associated with the GLP-1 driven eating behavior. And B, because food freshness and waste reduction, if you look into that particular consumer needs, Danone has also leaned heavily into ingredient transparency and simplified formulations, helping maintain that consumer trust even as these products technically fall under the ultra processed food categories. So, for the takeaway for executives is quite clear. Danone's approach shows how legacy portfolios can evolve, not necessarily by removing processing, but by really aligning it with the outcomes that the consumers increasingly care about and reframing processing to deliver measurable health outcomes, particularly in the spaces of protein density or reduced sugar and digestive health benefits. Going back to this innovation dilemmas that we began with, and how this is experienced by different teams in your organization. Now, the executives, you want to cut through the noise. There are too many signals, too many opinions. The R&D leaders, you want to keep your pipeline relevant to translate science into solutions that consumers can actually use. And the consumer insights team, you don't just want to diagnose the problems, but you want to drive an action early on. And now that we have seen ultra processed foods through the Helix model, in the following part, Lauren and I will show you how Helix solves all of these while also giving everyone a common language that connects strategy, technology, and insights through one shared model so that each team sees exactly how their work is tied into growth of that company.
So once the insights are connected, the Helix really drives value in 5 powerful ways. Firstly, we have new product creation. It helps reveal unmet consumer jobs that can be solved with technologies that are already ready for market. So imagine launching a digital food classification tool, for example, that allows consumers to better understand the processed ingredients in their food. Secondly, it helps with product enhancement by targeting the pain points consumers talk about most urgently, such as packaged food that doesn't meet their nutritional standards. And thirdly, the Helix allows us to reposition existing capabilities. So we can take an underutilized R&D asset and align that with consumer jobs, for example, such as highlighting the use of biopreservatives to extend shelf life, which we know is important for consumers. And then we also have cross-sector application. The Helix allows us to move proven technology into new contexts with urgent needs. For example, think of the potential impact of leveraging controlled release systems to improve nutrient absorption. And then finally, we have portfolio prioritization. This helps us to compare multiple opportunities and focus resources where adoption likelihood is the highest. For example, should you prioritize clean label food coloring or target more robust nutrition? All of this is what makes the Helix different. It doesn't just identify needs, it directs action. It makes innovation inevitable rather than accidental. And so it should be clear by now that we feel technology-centric roadmaps are over. The future of innovation has to start with human insight.
So, to wrap up, as the key takeaways, now that we know how the Lux Helix works and it's industry agnostic, but when we look specifically into ultra processed foods today, it is crucial to weigh the importance of long-standing urgent needs against those that are emerging and maturing quickly. So, in order to future-proof, you will require us to understand the overlap between these two and then identify those clusters. So, for example, in the context of ultra processed foods, now in terms of the consumer pain points, how bold or slow releasing flavor can be paired with, say, low sugar or enhanced nutrition solutions. Talking about the future proofing short term unmet needs with long term ones brings us to the second takeaway, which is investing in house or in partnership for technologies and platforms that solve multiple unmet needs, respective focus areas of companies, and that is undeniably a strong bet for any company. We saw that rightly in the case of Danone's positioning of its dairy portfolio to meet several of the consumers' unmet needs that we discussed. And last but not the least, within the conversation of ultra processed foods, it is now evident that the ultra processed foods aren't going away, but they're only intensifying from here. What we are seeing in recent company moves is a shift from defending processing to really proving its value. So the winners would not avoid ultra processed foods, but they'll just consolidate their platforms around delivering nutrition or satiety or convenience and consumer trust. So if you do not act here, you risk falling behind as the definition of acceptable processing gets rewritten. It's just how you do that consistently based on robust underlying data in a way that is transparent and reliable and scalable across datasets that are currently disconnected. And with that, we wrap up our today's webinar on ultra-processed foods and the Lux Innovation Helix.
Thank you so much, Urvi and Lauren. Such an insightful presentation there. We are ready to take in some questions here. So I'm looking at the question box here. So please keep them coming. Guess we already have one. I think it's more on the consumer side as I see. So a lot of consumers say that they want less of one ingredient or more of another, but often there is also the say to do gap, right? What they say and what they do doesn't really match up. So how do you actually know that these jobs are the ones that consumers care about, and how do you have enough data that they can action on them?
Right. Yeah, it's certainly a consistent problem that we see with trying to assess consumer behavior and beliefs. The benefit to taking our jobs to be done framework with the Helix is that we're looking primarily at product reviews to understand the pain points and unmet needs. We do look at broader consumer conversations online as well, but we're really focused on those product reviews. And that's really important because then we know that it's a product that the consumer has tried, and we know that the pain point is real because it's unprompted. They're leaving these reviews voluntarily, and we know that if they're leaving that review and they have a strong enough opinion to complain or to list something that's missing, we know that it's important to them, and we know that it's something that they have firsthand experience with. So we can eliminate some of the uncertainty related to that say-do gap.
Very interesting. I think we're getting a number of questions, but I do feel, I'm afraid, maybe we have one short question to be answered here. It's kind of like connecting the technology and the consumer aspect that you brought up. Maybe Urbi or Lauren, feel free to chime in here. But where do you actually see the biggest gaps when you think about consumers, what actually they need? Lauren brought up a number of those, but also where companies are investing, like food and beverage companies. Ruby, probably you want to take it?
I can take this. So when I was in the process of doing this Helix, what really struck me is the process of how the R&D teams are trying to do technologies, sometimes really not connecting with the consumer side. So while I was doing this Innovation Helix, and I was looking at the hiring and firing statements that came up with each of the unmet needs, that is where it made sense how to connect those statements with the technologies that are emerging or the technologies that the companies are working on. And I think that is how the gap can be addressed, which is really in going in depth into the pain points of the consumer urgent needs. Anything you want to add here, Lauren?
No, I think you nailed it. That hiring and firing criteria, like I said, it's not just a list of complaints. It's a signal, and it's a compass that is very useful for us.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much, Lauren Norby. I think that pretty much concludes our webinar for today. The slide presentation and the recording from this webinar will be sent to all the attendees via email. After leaving the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation, and we really appreciate your feedback because it helps us to inform and improve some of our future webinars. So take a moment and also check out some of our upcoming webinars on our website. And thank you all for joining today, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you so much.